Close your eyes for a second and try to imagine a world where your phone doesn't exist, your car isn't in the driveway, and even the lights in your house are gone. Instead, you are standing in a crowded, noisy street made of big, flat stones. You smell roasted meat, dusty air, and a lot of people who haven't showered in a week. All around you, people are shouting in a language that sounds powerful and strange. You are in the middle of Rome at its very best. This wasn't just a place in a history book, it was a real, living world full of people just like you, trying to find a way to be happy, stay safe, and get a good meal. Most of the time, when we think about the Romans, we only think about the big stuff. We think about the giant stone buildings like the Colosseum or the statues of men with angry faces and curly hair. But history is really about the small things. It's about the guy selling bread on the corner, the mother trying to keep her kids quiet in a tiny apartment, and the soldier who is miles away from home and feeling a little bit lonely. To really get a feel for this time, we have to look at what life was actually like in ancient Rome. It wasn't always pretty, but it was definitely never boring. The Roman Empire was so big that it's almost hard to wrap your head around it. Imagine a map. Now, imagine one group of people in charge of almost everything you see. They had the rainy hills of England, the sunny beaches of Spain, the deep forests of Germany, and the hot sand of Egypt. It was a world where you could travel for thousands of miles and still be under the same laws, use the same money, and speak the same language. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because the Romans were obsessed with being organized and being the best. When we talk about the history of this place, people often focus on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. But before it could fall, it had to reach a point where it felt like it would last forever. At its peak, the city of Rome was the center of the universe. Over 1 million people lived there. Think about that for a second. 1 million people in a city without electricity, without cars, and without plastic. How did they do it? How did they feed everyone? How did they keep the city from smelling like a giant garbage dump? The answer is that they were some of the smartest builders to ever live. They didn't just build things to look good, they built things to work. They brought fresh water from the mountains using giant stone bridges. They built sewers that were so good they stayed in use for thousands of years. They built roads that were so straight and so strong that you can still find them under the grass in Europe today. They were the world's first real engineers, and they used that skill to make life as comfortable as they could. But even with all those great buildings, life in Rome was very different depending on who you were. If you were born into a rich family, you were a patrician. These were the elites. They lived in houses called domus. These weren't just houses, they were like mini palaces. They were built around a big open space in the middle called an atrium. This let the light in and allowed the rain to fall into a small pool, which kept the house cool during the hot Italian summers. The walls were covered in bright paintings of gardens, gods, and heroes. The floors weren't made of wood, they were made of tiny colored stones called mosaics that formed beautiful pictures. If you were a rich Roman, your day started very early. You'd wake up when the sun came out, have a small snack, and then you'd spend your morning talking to people who wanted your help. This was a big part of Roman life. Rich people would help poor people with money or legal problems, and in return, those poor people would vote for them or help them in business. It was a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of world. After that, you might go to the Forum, which was the big open square inches the middle of the city where all the big decisions were made. But most people in Rome weren't rich. Most people were plebeians. These were the regular folks, the bakers, the builders, the people who worked in the shops. They didn't have fancy houses on the hills. They lived in insulae, which were basically the world's first apartment blocks. These buildings were crowded, noisy, and honestly, a bit dangerous. They were made of wood and cheap bricks, and they were so tall that they would sometimes just fall over. Because they were made of wood, fire was a constant fear. One tipped-over candle could burn down an entire neighborhood in an hour. In these apartments, life was tight. You might have a whole family living in just 1 or 2 small rooms. There was no running water in your room, so you had to go down to the street fountain to get water for cooking or drinking. There were no toilets either. If you had to go, you went to a public bathroom or you used the pot, and I'm sorry to say I threw it out the window. It made the streets pretty messy and smelly, which is why the Romans were so obsessed with their bathhouses. The bathhouse was the place to be. It wasn't just for getting clean, it was like a social club. Rich or poor, almost everyone went there. You'd go in and change out of your clothes. Then you'd move through different rooms. There was a warm room, a hot room that was like a steam room, and a cold room to jump into at the end. They didn't have soap, so they'd rub olive oil on their skin and scrape the dirt off with a metal tool. After that, they'd sit around and talk about sports, politics, or what they were having for dinner. It was the heart of the community. Food was a big deal for Romans, but it wasn't the same for everyone. For the poor, it was mostly about grain. They ate a lot of bread and the thick soup called porridge. The government actually gave out free grain to the poor people in the city to make sure they didn't get hungry and start a revolution. This was part of a plan called bread and circuses. If the people had full bellies and something fun to watch, they wouldn't complain about the government. The circus's part of that plan was the entertainment. The Romans loved a good show, and they liked them loud and bloody. The Colosseum was the place for gladiators. These were usually slaves or criminals who were trained to fight. Some fought with swords, some with nets, and some even fought wild animals like lions or bears that were brought in from faraway lands. It was a brutal way to spend an afternoon, but the crowds loved it. The best gladiators were like modern sports stars. People would write their names on the walls and buy little toys shaped like them. Then there were the chariot races at the Circus Maximus. This was a giant stadium that could hold way more people than the Colosseum. Imagine 4 horse teams racing around a track at high speeds. It was incredibly dangerous, and crashes were very common. The fans were crazy about their teams. They wore the colors of their team, the red, white, blue, or green, and they would sometimes get into huge fights with fans of the other teams. It shows that even 2,000 years ago, people were just as passionate about sports as they are today. While all this was happening in the city, the Roman army was out on the edges of the world keeping everything safe. Being a soldier in Rome was a full-time job. You signed up for 20 years, and it was hard work. You had to march 4 miles every day carrying a heavy pack, a shield, and your weapons. But for a poor kid from the countryside, it was a way to see the world and eventually own some land of his own. The army was the backbone of the empire. Without those soldiers, the peace of Rome, what they called the Pax Romana, would never have happened. Everything in Rome was based on the family. The father, or the paterfamilias, was the absolute boss of the house. By law, he had the power to make all the big decisions for his wife and kids. But even though the men had the legal power, Roman women were actually very strong. They ran the households, managed the money, and often had a huge say in what happened in the city. Some women even ran their own businesses, which was pretty rare in the ancient world. The kids in Rome didn't have it easy either. If you were from a wealthy family, you went to school to learn how to read, write, and most importantly how to give a speech. Romans believed that being able to talk well was the key to success. If you were poor, you didn't go to school. You started working with your parents as soon as you were old enough to hold a tool. There was no such thing as being a teenager back then. You were either a child or you were an adult with a job. Let's keep our walk through the city going. One thing you'd notice right away is that the Romans were obsessed with organization. They didn't just build houses wherever they felt like it. If you were in a Roman city, the streets usually moved in a grid, almost like a giant chessboard. They had 2 main roads that met in the very middle of the city. Everything else grew out from that center point. This made it really easy to find your way around, even if you were new in town. At the center of it all was the Forum. Think of the Forum as the city's living room. It was a giant open square with the most important buildings all around it. This was where people went to hear the news, watch a trial, or even just buy some fresh fish. If there was a big announcement from the emperor, this is where you'd hear it. It was loud, it was crowded, and it was the place where all the big decisions were made. Imagine hundreds of people in white robes all talking at once. That was a typical day in the Forum. But let's look at where most people actually lived. We talked a bit about the insulae, those apartment buildings. They were usually 4 or 5 stories high. The ground floor was where the action was. It was usually full of shops. You might have a bakery on one corner, a place to buy wine on the other, and a blacksmith in the middle. The people who owned these shops lived in the rooms right above them. The higher up you lived in the building, the poorer you were. This is because there were no elevators, and the higher floors were the most dangerous if a fire broke out. There were no fire escapes back then. If you were lucky enough to be rich, your domus or private house was like a different world. It was quiet, it was clean, and it had a special feature called the atrium. This was a big room in the middle with a hole in the roof. Under that hole was a shallow pool of water. It sounds like the roof was broken, but it was actually a smart way to get fresh air and keep the house cool. The walls were painted with bright colors, and they had beautiful gardens in the back where they could hide away from the noise of the city. To see how these two worlds existed at the same time, you really have to look at what life was actually like in ancient Rome. Now, let's talk about the family. In Rome, the family was everything, but it was a bit different from how we think about families today. The head of the house was the father, and they called him the paterfamilias. In the eyes of the law, he was the absolute boss. He had power over his wife, his children, and his slaves. It sounds a bit scary, but it was how they kept order. However, even though the father was the boss on paper, Roman women actually had a lot more freedom than women in other parts of the world back then. They could own their own property. They could get a divorce if they needed to, and they were the ones who really ran the house every day. Speaking of the house, it wasn't just family living there. Slaves were a huge part of the Roman world. It's a sad part of their history, but you can't talk about Rome without them. Slaves did everything. They cooked the food, they cleaned the clothes, they worked in the fields, and some even taught the children how to read and write. Some slaves were treated okay, almost like part of the family, but others had a very hard life working in mines or on big farms. It was a system that the whole economy relied on, and it was one of the reasons why the rich were able to stay so rich. One thing that still shocks people today is how advanced the Romans were when it came to keeping things clean. They built these massive stone bridges called aqueducts. These weren't for people to walk on, they were for water. The water would flow down from the mountains, miles and miles away, and come right into the city. Because they had so much fresh water, they could have public fountains and those famous public baths. The baths were the most popular place in town. You'd go there almost every afternoon. First, you'd do some exercise, like wrestling or throwing a ball. Then, you'd go through different rooms, a warm one, a hot one, and a cold one. They even had underfloor heating. They would burn wood in a basement to send hot air under the stone floors of the bathhouse to keep the water warm. It was incredible engineering for people who lived 2,000 years ago. But they didn't just worry about bringing clean water in, they also worried about getting the dirty water out. They built a giant sewer called the Cloaca Maxima. It was a huge underground tunnel that carried all the waste from the city out to the river. It was one of the first times in history that a city tried to stay sanitary on such a big scale. It's a big part of why the city was able to grow so large without everyone getting sick all the time. When it came to food, the Romans liked to keep it simple unless they were having a big party. Most people ate things like wheat, barley, beans, and vegetables. They loved fruit, especially grapes and figs. Meat was expensive, so regular people didn't have it very often. But they had plenty of wine. Everyone drank wine, but they didn't drink it like we do today. They almost always mixed it with water because drinking pure wine was seen as something only uneducated people would do. They even gave watered-down wine to children. Education was also very important to the Romans. If you had the money, you'd hire a private teacher to come to your house. If you weren't as rich, you'd send your kids to a small school in the corner of a marketplace. The kids would learn how to read, write, and do math. But the biggest goal for a Roman student was to learn how to speak in public. They wanted their children to grow up to be great speakers who could convince people in the forum. They were taught to be brave, to be respectful, and to work hard for the good of Rome. Religion was woven into every single thing they did. They didn't just pray on one day a week, they prayed every day. Every house had a small shrine where the family would leave little bits of food or flowers for the gods that protected their home. They believed that if they were piousa, which meant being respectful to the gods and their family, then the gods would make sure they were successful in life. This deep belief in the gods is a big part of the story when you look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. As we move through our day in Rome, we start to see that even though they didn't have the technology we have today, they were dealing with a lot of the same problems. They had to deal with high rent, crowded streets, and how to keep their families safe and fed. They were smart, they were tough, and they built a world that changed everything for the people who came after them. We've seen where the Romans lived and worked, but now let's talk about what they did for fun. You've probably heard of the Colosseum, right? It's that huge stone stadium in the middle of Rome. Back then, it was the place to be. If you think modern football stadiums are loud, they've got nothing on this place. It could hold about 50,000 people, and everyone was there to see a show. But it wasn't a play or a concerta, it was usually a fight. To really see what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to understand the gladiators. Most people think they were just slaves forced to fight until they died, and while that happened, it was a bit more like professional wrestling or boxing today. These guys were trained athletes, they lived in special schools and had doctors and trainers. Some gladiators became famous. People would write their names on the walls of the city, and kids would play with little wooden toys made to look like their favorite fighters. Even though the fights were very dangerous and people did get hurt or killed, it was the biggest sport in the world. But the Colosseum wasn't just for fighting. Sometimes, they would fill the whole bottom area with water and bring in boats to have a fake sea battle. It's crazy to think about, but they had the plumbing to make it happen. They also brought in animals from all over the world, lions, tigers, and even elephants. For many Romans, this was the only way they would ever see a creature from Africa or the East. It was their version of a zoo, but much more intense. If you weren't into the fighting, you probably went to the Circus Maximus for the chariot races. This was a giant track, much bigger than the Colosseum. It could hold more than 150,000 people. Imagine 4 teams of horses racing around a long track at high speeds. The drivers were called charioteers, and they were the highest paid athletes in history. People were obsessed with their teams. They had the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens. If you were a blue fan, you hated the greens. They would even get into huge fights in the streets after the races were over. It was the original sports rivalry. When they weren't watching sports, the Romans were world-class shoppers. If you wanted the best stuff, you went to Trajan's Market. It was basically the world's first shopping mall. It had over 150 different shops spread out over several floors. You could buy anything there. Fine silk from the East, olive oil from Spain, or even rare spices from India. The marketplace was the heart of the city's energy. It was where you went to hear the latest gossip or find out what the emperor was up to. This brings us to one of the most interesting parts of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire: how they kept so many people happy. The government knew that if the people had full bellies and were entertained, they wouldn't try to overthrow the leaders. They called this bread and circuses. They gave out free grain so no one would starve, and they put on these massive shows for free so everyone felt like they were part of something great. It was a clever way to keep 1 million people under control without needing a huge police force in every alley. But what about the evening? When the sun went down, the rich Romans would have their big dinner parties. These were called a convivium. Now, they didn't sit at a table like we do. They had 3 big couches arranged in a square, and they would lie down on their sides to eat. They thought sitting up to eat was for people who were in a hurry. A fancy dinner could have 10 or 20 courses. They ate some things we would think are very strange, like flamingo tongues or dormice cooked in honey. And we have to talk about that sauce aganagarum. They loved it. It was made by putting fish guts in a big jar with salt and letting it sit in the sun for months. It turned into a thin, salty liquid that smelled terrible, but they thought it made everything taste better. They used it on meat, on vegetables, and sometimes even in their wine. It was like their version of soy sauce or fish sauce today. Speaking of wine, they had it at every meal, but they always mixed it with water. If you drank your wine straight, people would think you were a drunk or a barbarian who didn't have any manners. While the rich were having their fancy parties, the regular people were probably heading to a local tavern. These were called popani. They were small, dark shops where you could get a warm bowl of stew and a cup of cheap wine. Since most people lived in tiny apartments without kitchens, these taverns were where they had their dinner every night. It was loud. People would be playing games with dice, and it was the place where the common people could relax after a long day of work. As night fell, Rome changed. There were no streetlights, so the alleys were pitch black. If you were rich, you'd have a group of slaves walk with you carrying torches to keep you safe. If you were poor, you stayed inside. Crime was common at night, and without lights, it was hard for the city guards to keep track of everything. The sounds of the die of the hammers, the carts, the shouting would fade away, and you'd just hear the wind through the stone arches and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Even in the quiet of the night, you could feel how big this place was. Rome wasn't just a city, it was an idea. It was a place where people from all over the world came together. It had its problems, like the crowded apartments and the dangerous streets, but it also had these incredible moments of beauty and excitement. Whether it was a chariot race or a quiet dinner with family, the Romans lived life to the fullest. Now, we've talked about the city, the food, and the games, but we haven't talked about the one thing that made all of that possible: the Roman army. You see, Rome didn't just become a giant empire by accident. They were the most organized group of people the world had ever seen. If you want to understand the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, you have to understand the men who stood on the front lines. These weren't just guys with swords, they were professional workers who treated war like a 9-to-5 job. Imagine you are a young man living in a small village. You don't have much money, and your family doesn't own any land. Your best chance at a better life was to join the army. But this wasn't like joining a local gang. When you signed up to be a legionary, you were promising to give 25 years of your life to Rome. That's a long time. You couldn't even get married while you were a soldier. It was a total commitment. But in return, you got regular pay, 3 meals a day, and the chance to become a citizen if you weren't one already. The training was absolutely brutal. They didn't start with swords, they started with walking. They made you march 20 miles in a single day, carrying about 60 pounds of gear on your back. That's like carrying a large dog in your backpack while walking for 5 hours straight. And they didn't just walk on flat ground, they went through mud, over hills, and across rivers. They did this until your legs felt like jelly. They wanted to make sure that when a battle happened, you wouldn't be too tired to fight. To really get a feel for what life was actually like in ancient Rome's army, you have to look at their gear. Everything they carried had a purpose. They had a big shield called a scutum. It was curved so it would wrap around your body. When a bunch of soldiers stood together, they could overlap their shields to create a wall of wood and leather that arrows couldn't get through. Then they had a short sword called the gladius. It wasn't meant for big, swinging motions like you see in movies. It was made for quick, short stabs. In a crowded battle where people are pushing against each other, a short sword is much better than a long one. They also carried 2 heavy spears called pila. These were very smart. The tip was made of soft iron. When a soldier threw the spear and it hit an enemy's shield, the tip would bend. This meant the enemy couldn't pull it out and throw it back. It also made their shield so heavy and awkward that they would usually just drop it, leaving them with no protection. The Romans were always thinking 2 steps ahead. But the most amazing thing about the Roman army wasn't their fighting, it was their building. Every single night, no matter how tired they were, the soldiers would build a fort. They would dig a big ditch around a square area and build a wooden wall with the dirt they dug up. Inside, they would set up their tents in perfect rows. It was like a tiny city that they built and tore down every single day. This meant they were never caught off guard while they were sleeping. They were safe, organized, and ready for anything. The men in charge of these soldiers were called centurions. These guys were the toughest people in the empire. They weren't rich nobles, they were soldiers who had worked their way up from the bottom. They carried a vine stick that they used to hit any soldier who wasn't following orders. Everyone was afraid of the centurion, but they also respected him because he knew exactly how to win a fight. Life in a Roman army camp wasn't just about training. There was a lot of boring stuff too. Soldiers had to clean their gear, cook their own bread, and even help build roads and bridges. In fact, most of the famous Roman roads were built by soldiers, not by regular workers. When they weren't fighting a war, the emperor kept them busy so they wouldn't get bored and start a rebellion. They built the infrastructure that held the whole empire together. What did they eat? Mostly grain. Each group of 8 soldiers shared a tent and a small mill to grind their own wheat. They would make a thick porridge or bake flatbread. They also got some salt, some vinegar, which they mixed with water to make a drink called pasca, and occasionally some bacon or cheese. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to keep them strong. If you were a soldier stationed far away, like in Britain or Germany, life could be pretty lonely. You were miles away from the sunny streets of Rome, living in a cold, rainy forest. But the Romans brought their culture with them. Even in the middle of nowhere, they would build bathhouses and small theaters for the soldiers. They wanted to feel like they were still in Rome, even if they were on the other side of the world. The most dangerous part of the job, of course, was the actual battle. But the Romans didn't just run and screaming. They moved like a machine. They had signals with trumpets and flags so everyone knew what to do. If the commander wanted the soldiers to move left, the trumpet would blow a specific sound, and thousands of men would move at the exact same time. It was terrifying for their enemies to see this wall of red and silver moving toward them without making a sound. If you survived your 25 years, you were a hero. You got a big payout, sometimes enough to buy a farm or start a business. Many soldiers would stay in the places where they were stationed, marry a local woman, and start a new life. This is how the Roman language and culture spread so far. These retired soldiers were like the influencers of the ancient world, showing everyone how to live like a Roman. But the army was also expensive. As the empire got bigger, they needed more and more soldiers. Eventually, it became hard to pay them all. This is one of the secrets behind the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. When the soldiers didn't get their pay, they stopped being loyal to Rome and started being loyal to their generals. This led to civil wars and big problems that eventually hurt the empire. It's easy to look back and think these soldiers were just heartless fighters, but they were people with families and dreams. They wrote letters home on thin pieces of wood, asking for warm socks or telling their parents they were okay. We've found some of these letters today, and they are heartbreaking. One soldier wrote to his family asking them to send him more money because the army food was terrible. Some things never change, right? The Roman army was the muscle that kept the heart of Rome beating. Without them, there would be no big theaters, no fancy dinner parties, and no beautiful statues. They protected the trade routes so that silk and spices could get to the markets. They kept the peace so that builders could finish the giant aqueducts. They were the foundation of everything we've talked about so far. We've talked about the big stuff of the soldiers and the giant buildings, but what about the people who weren't in charge? What about the kids, the women, and the people who were hidden in the shadows? If you want to see what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to look at how a person started their life. Life for a Roman baby was a bit of a gamble. When a baby was born, they didn't just automatically become part of the family. The father had to officially accept the child. He would pick the baby up in his arms to show everyone that this child was his and that he would take care of it. If he didn't, it was a very sad story. But if he did, the family would have a big party 8 or 9 days later. They would give the baby a special necklace called a bulla. It was like a little locket made of gold or leather, and it was supposed to protect them from bad luck and evil spirits. Kids wore these until they grew up. Growing up in Rome was tough but also kind of fun. Even though they didn't have video games or TV, Roman kids were just like kids today. They played with dolls made of clay or wood. They had marble games, and they even played hide and seek. They used walnuts instead of marbles sometimes because walnuts were cheap and easy to find. You might see a group of kids sitting on the steps of a big temple, yelling and laughing as they played a game of heads or ships, which was their version of heads or tails. When it was time to learn, things got serious. If your family had a little bit of money, you'd be sent to a ludi. This wasn't a big school building. It was usually just a small area in the back of a shop or a porch on the street. It was loud, dusty, and the teachers were very strict. They didn't have paper, so they used wooden tablets covered in a thin layer of wax. You'd use a pointy stick to scratch your letters into the wax. If you made a mistake, you'd just use the flat end of the stick to smooth the wax out and try again. It was like an ancient version of a tablet, but without the battery. The main thing they studied was the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But they also had to memorize long poems and stories about Roman heroes. The teachers weren't afraid to use a cane if a student was being lazy or talking too much. They believed that a hard education made a strong person. If you were a girl, you might stay at home to learn how to run a household. But many Roman girls also learned how to read and write. The Romans knew that a smart mother made for a smart family. Now, let's talk about the women of Rome. In many history books, you only hear about the men, But women were the backbone of the whole society. Even though they couldn't vote, they had a huge amount of influence. A Roman woman, especially a mother, was highly respected. She was the matrona, the lady of the house. She managed the slaves, kept track of the money, and made sure everything was running smoothly while the men were off at work or at war. Some women were even successful business owners. We've found records of women who owned brick-making factories, managed farms, or ran their own shops in the market. They were tough, smart, and they knew how to get things done. In fact, many of the big political decisions made in the forum were actually whispered into the ears of the politicians by their wives at home. It's a huge part of the story of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The families behind the scenes were just as important as the soldiers on the field. But we can't forget the people who did the most work for the least credit, the slaves. About 1 out of every 3 people in Rome was a slave. It's hard for us to understand now, but back then, it was just a normal part of life. Slaves weren't all the same, though. If you were a city slave, your life might not be too bad. You might work as a secretary, a cook, or a teacher. Some slaves were even able to save up their own money and eventually buy their freedom. When a slave was freed, it was a huge deal. They would wear a special hat called a pileus to show everyone that they were now a free citizen. On the other hand, rural slaves had it much worse. They worked on massive farms or in deep mines. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and they didn't have much hope of ever being free. This huge group of people was the engine that kept the empire running. They grew the food, they built the roads, and they cleaned the streets. Without them, the Roman world would have stopped moving in a single day. One thing that really made Roman life different from ours was how much time they spent outside. Because their apartments were so small and crowded, the street was where everything happened. The street was your living room, your dining room, and your news station. You'd walk outside and see people getting their hair cut by a barber right on the sidewalk. You'd see people arguing about politics, or neighbors gossiping about who was having a party that night. The markets were always full of noise. You'd hear the clanking of the blacksmith's hammer and the shouting of the fishmonger. People would haggle over every single penny. There were no fixed prices like we have in stores today. If you wanted a loaf of bread, you had to argue with the baker until you both agreed on a price. It made every simple errand into a big social event. As the day went on, the heat would start to rise. Rome could get very hot in the summer, and the smell of the city would get, well, pretty strong. With 1 million people and lots of animals, the Cloaca Maximus sewer could only do so much. This is why the afternoon was the time for the baths. Everyone wanted to escape the heat and the dust. It was a time to relax, to feel human again, and to forget about the hard work of the morning. Even though their lives were so different from ours, you can see that they had the same basic feelings. They loved their kids, they worried about money, and they wanted to have a bit of fun when the work was done. They built a world that was complicated and sometimes cruel, but it was also full of life and energy. If you lived in Rome and woke up with a bad headache or a broken leg, things were about to get very interesting and probably a little scary. You see, the Romans didn't know about germs. They didn't know why people got sick, so they came up with their own ideas. To really understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to look at how they handled being sick. If you had the money, you'd go to a doctor, but back then, anyone could call themselves a doctor. There were no big tests or degrees. You just had to convince people you knew what you were doing. Most doctors thought that your body was full of 4 different liquids, and if you got sick, it meant those liquids were out of balance. Their favorite way to fix you was to use leeches to suck your blood or to make you throw up. It sounds like something from one of those videos about the most terrifying jobs in history, doesn't it? But they were actually really good at some things. They were amazing at fixing broken bones and cleaning wounds with wine and vinegar, which actually helped kill bacteria, even if they didn't know why. But for most Romans, if the doctor couldn't help, they turned to the gods. Religion wasn't something they just did on the weekend. It was part of every single hour. They didn't have just one god, they had thousands. If you had a toothache, there was a specific god for that. If you were going on a long trip, you talked to the god of the roads. It was like a giant contract. You'd say to the god, "If you help me get better, I will give you a gift. These gifts could be anything from a bowl of fruit to a small clay model of the body part that was hurting. If your leg got better, you'd buy a little clay leg and leave it at the temple to say thank you. The Romans were also incredibly superstitious. They believed that the world was full of signs and omens. Before a general went into battle or a politician made a big speech, they would check for signs. They'd look at the way birds were flying or even have a special priest look at the guts of a sacrificed animal to see what the future held. It sounds crazy to us, but they truly believed that the gods were constantly sending them messages. If you tripped over your doorstep in the morning, you might just turn around and go back to bed because you thought the whole day was going to be cursed. One of the most famous examples of this was with sacred chickens. Believe it or not, the Roman Navy used to bring chickens on their ships. Before a big sea battle, they'd give the chickens some grain. If the chickens ate it, it meant the gods were happy and they would win. If the chickens didn't eat, it was a bad sign. There's a story about one commander who got so mad when the chickens wouldn't eat that he threw them into the ocean and said, "If they won't eat, let them drink." He lost the battle, and everyone blamed him for disrespecting the birds. This deep belief in signs and gods is a big reason why they were so successful. It gave them the confidence to do things that seemed impossible, but it also meant they were always looking over their shoulders. They were terrified of the evil eye. They wore special charms and amulets to protect themselves from people who might be jealous of them. Even the kids, as I mentioned before, wore their bulla lockets to keep the bad spirits away. When someone died, it was a huge event for the whole neighborhood. The Romans believed that if you weren't buried properly, your spirit would wander around and haunt the living. The rich had big, fancy tombs built along the roads leading into the city. They wanted everyone who walked by to see their name and remember how important they were. The poor were usually buried in large pits outside the city walls, but no matter how much money you had, your family would have a big feast to remember you. They would even set a place at the table for the person who had passed away, believing their spirit was there eating with them. This brings us to the lairarium. This was a small shrine found in almost every single house, from the biggest palace to the smallest apartment. It was where the lares, the spirits that protected the home, lived. Every morning, the head of the family would say a prayer here. They felt that as long as they took care of their home spirits, their family would stay safe from fire, sickness, and bad luck. It shows that even in a world of giant armies and huge stone buildings, the most important thing to a Roman was their own home and their own family. As we look at their doctors and their gods, we see a people who were trying to make sense of a world that could be very cruel. They used whatever tools they had, whether it was a sharp knife, a clay statue, or a lucky charm. They were a people who lived on the edge of life and death every day, and that's what made them so tough. It's also one of the things that makes the rise and fall of the Roman Empire so fascinating. Their spirit was as strong as the concrete they used to build their temples. We've talked about the gods and the doctors, but what happened when someone broke the rules? In a city with 1 million people, things are going to get messy. To understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to look at how they kept everyone in line. Rome didn't have a police force like we do today. There were no sirens or blue lights. If someone stole your wallet or broke into your shop, you couldn't just pick up a phone and call for help. You usually had to catch the guy yourself or get your neighbors to help you. Because there were no regular police, the streets at night were ruled by gangs and criminals. If you were a rich person and you had to walk home in the dark, you wouldn't go alone. You'd have a group of tough slaves with torches walking around you like a human shield. But if you were a regular person, you just stayed inside and locked your door tight. This is part of the secrets of the Roman underworld that most people don't talk about. It was a city of beauty, but it was also a city of shadows. To try and keep some order, the emperor had a special group of soldiers called the urban cohorts. Their job was to walk around the city during the day and make sure no big riot started. But their main goal wasn't really to help you find your lost cat or catch a thief. It was to protect the government. If you got into a fight with your neighbor over a fence or a debt, you'd have to go to a judge in the forum. Roman law was very strict. They believed that the law should be written down so everyone knew what the rules were. If you were a citizen, you had the right to stand in front of a judge and explain your side. If you were rich, You could hire a lawyer, someone who was a great public speaker, to help you win. But if you were a slave or a non-citizen, the law was much harsher. The punishments in Rome were designed to scare people so they wouldn't commit crimes. If you did something small, like stealing a loaf of bread, you might just have to pay a fine or get a beating. But if you did something big, like hurting a high-ranking official or starting a fire, the punishments were terrifying. This is where we see the crime and punishment in ancient Rome that sounds like a nightmare. They had things like the sack punishment, where a person who hurt their own father was put in a big leather bag with a dog, a snake, and a rooster, and then thrown into the river. They wanted the punishment to fit the crime, and they wanted it to be a show. But order wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about stopping fires. Like I told you before, Rome was a giant pile of wood and cheap bricks. Fire was the biggest danger. To fight this, the Romans created the vigils. These were the world's first real firefighters. They walked the streets at night, carrying buckets of water and axes. They weren't just there to put out fires, they were also looking for anyone who was breaking the fire safety rules. If they caught you with a dangerous stove or a candle that was too close to a curtain, they might give you a beating right there on the spot. Now, let's move away from the noise and the crime of the city for a bit. We've spent a lot of time in Rome, but most people in the empire didn't actually live in the city. Most people lived on farms. These were the people who grew the food that fed the million people in Rome. Life on a Roman farm was quiet, hard, and dictated by the sun. You woke up when the sun rose. You worked in the fields all day, and you went to sleep when it got dark. There were two kinds of farms. You had the small family farms where people grew just enough to eat and a little bit more to sell at the local market. And then you had the latifundia. These were giant estates owned by the super-rich politicians in Rome. These massive farms were run by hundreds of slaves who lived in barracks and worked from dawn until dusk. These big farms grew things like grapes for wine and olives for oil. In fact, olive oil was like the liquid gold of the Roman world. They used it for cooking, for cleaning their bodies at the baths, and for fuel in their lamps. Life in the countryside was much slower than in the city, but it was also where the real Romans felt their spirit was. Many of the most famous Roman writers said that the city of Rome was a place of greed and noise, but the farm was a place of virtue and strength. They thought that working the land made a man tough and honest. Even the emperors would sometimes talk about how much they loved their gardens and their farms, even if they never actually picked up a shovel themselves. Whether you lived in a crowded apartment in the city or a quiet stone house in the country, you were part of the same giant system. You used the same coins, you followed the same laws, and you looked toward the same emperor for protection. It was a world that felt very permanent, like it would never end, and for a long time, it didn't. This stability is the core of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. As long as the laws were followed and the farms were producing, the empire stayed strong. But as we keep going, we are going to see how that strength started to crack. We are going to look at what happened when the money started to run out and the leaders started to care more about themselves than the people. But for now, just imagine yourself walking out of the noisy city gates, through the big stone arch, and out onto a straight, quiet road that leads into the green hills. The air is fresh, the sun is warm, and the only sound is the chirping of birds. This was the other side of Rome. We've seen the city and we've seen the farms. But how did everything get from one place to another? If you wanted to buy a silk scarf in Rome, that silk had to come all the way from China. If you wanted a special spice for your dinner, it might have come from India. To understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to see it as the world's first giant marketplace. The Romans didn't just stay in Italy, they turned the whole Mediterranean Sea into their own private lake. They actually called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, which just means our sea. And they weren't joking. Every single piece of land around that water belonged to Rome. This made the sea the fastest and cheapest way to move things. If you tried to carry a giant wagon of grain over the mountains, it would take forever and cost a fortune. But on a big wooden ship, you could move tons of food across the water in just a few weeks. These ships were called corbetti. They were big, slow, and shaped a bit like a bathtub. They didn't have engines, of course, so they relied entirely on the wind. This meant that for a few months every winter, the sea basically shut down because the storms were too dangerous. But during the summer, The water was covered in ships. The most important ships were the ones carrying grain from Egypt. Rome was so big that it couldn't grow enough food to feed itself. If those grain ships from Egypt didn't show up, the people in the city would start to starve. It was a huge job to keep those trade routes safe. To make sure the ships knew where they were going, the Romans built massive lighthouses. The most famous one was in Alexandria, Egypt, and it was one of the tallest buildings in the world back then. They also built giant harbors with docks made of that special underwater concrete we talked about. This allowed them to bring in exotic things like elephants from Africa, purple dye from the coast of Lebanon, and tin from the cold islands of Britain. If you had the money, you could basically buy anything in the world right there in the streets of Rome. But what if you weren't on a ship? That's where the roads come in. I've mentioned them before, but you have to understand how incredible they were. These weren't just dirt paths. They were made of layers of sand, gravel, and big flat stones on top. They were built to be slightly curved so that when it rained, the water would run off into the sides and the road would stay dry. Every mile, there was a big stone post called a milestone. It told you exactly how far you were from the next town and how far you were from the city of Rome. Traveling on these roads was a bit of an adventure. Most people walked. If you were a bit richer, you might try to mule or travel in a carriage. But there were no motels like we have today. Instead, there were small inns along the road. Most of them were pretty dirty and full of bedbugs, and the people who ran them didn't always have the best reputation. If you were really rich, you'd try to stay at a friend's house along the way instead of at an inn. While traveling, you'd see all kinds of people. You'd see soldiers marching to their next post, government messengers riding fast horses to deliver letters, and merchants with long lines of donkeys carrying wine or oil. This constant movement is a big part of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. As long as the roads and the seas were safe, the money kept flowing. But if pirates took over the sea or bandits took over the roads, the whole empire would start to hurt. Let's talk about that money. The Romans were the first people to use a currency that almost everyone trusted. They had gold coins, silver coins, and bronze coins. On one side, they usually hid the face of the emperor. This was like the ancient version of a newspaper. Since most people never saw the emperor in person, the coins were the only way they knew what he looked like. If a new emperor took over, he would immediately make new coins with his face on them so everyone knew who the boss was. People trusted Roman money because they knew the silver and gold in the coins were real. You could take a silver denarius and spend it in a shop in London, or a market in Turkey, or a bakery in Rome, and everyone would know exactly what it was worth. This made trade very easy. But later on, the emperors started getting greedy. They began mixing the silver with cheaper metals like copper to make more coins. This caused a big problem called inflation, where things started to cost more and more every year. It's a problem we still deal with today, and it was one of the things that eventually caused a lot of trouble for Rome. Even with the problems, the Roman economy was a marvel. They had banks where you could take out a loan. They had companies where people could invest their money together, and they even had a type of stock market in the forum. It was a very modern way of running things for people who lived 2,000 years ago. They realized that if you make it easy for people to buy and sell things, everyone gets a little bit richer. As you imagine these ships sailing across the blue water and the wagons rolling over the stone roads, you can see how connected the world was. A person in a cold forest in Germany might be drinking wine from a sunny hill in Italy out of a glass cup made in Egypt. It was the first time in history that the world felt small. The Romans brought everyone together into one big system, and for a few hundred years, it actually worked. We've talked about the soldiers, the workers, and the traders, but now we have to look at the people who were at the very top. These were the emperors. If you lived in the Roman Empire, the emperor wasn't just a politician, he was almost like a god on earth. His face was on every coin you spent. His name was on every big building, and his decisions could change your life in a heartbeat. But being an emperor wasn't all about wearing gold and eating grapes. To understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to see that the palace was often the most dangerous place in the city. The emperors lived on a hill in Rome called the Palatine Hill. In fact, that's where we get the word palace from. Their homes were massive, with marble floors that were kept warm by fires underneath and gardens that were full of rare plants and singing birds. But even with all that luxury, many emperors were terrified. Why? Because in Rome, power was a dangerous game. If you were the emperor, you had to watch your back every single day. Your own guards, your own family, or even your best friends might be plotting to take your place. This is the dark truth of the Roman emperors that you don't always see in the movies. Let's look at some of these men. The first one was a guy named Augustus. He was very smart. He didn't call himself a king because the Romans hated kings. Instead, he called himself the first citizen. He lived a relatively simple life compared to the ones who came after him. He wanted to show the people that he was just a regular guy who happened to be in charge. He fixed the roads, cleaned up the city, and brought peace after years of war. Because of him, the empire grew strong and stable. But then, you had the ones who were, well, a bit crazy. Have you ever heard of Caligula? He was an emperor who started off okay but then went completely wild. There are stories that he tried to make his favorite horse a high-ranking government official. He wanted people to treat him like a god while he was still alive. He spent money faster than the empire could make it, and eventually, his own guards got so tired of him that they took him out. It shows that even with all the power in the world, if you didn't have the respect of the people around you, you wouldn't last long. And then there was Nero. Most people remember him because of a giant fire that burned down half of Rome. Some people said he actually started the fire so he could clear away the old buildings and build a massive golden house for himself. Whether he did it or not, he used the space to build a palace that had a giant statue of himself that was over 100 feet tall. He loved music and acting, and he would force people to sit and watch him perform for hours. If you tried to leave while he was singing, you could get into big trouble. But it wasn't all crazy leaders. Rome also had some of the best leaders in history. There was a man named Marcus Aurelius. He was a philosopher king. Even though he had to spend most of his time fighting wars on the edges of the empire to keep Rome safe, he spent his nights writing down his thoughts about how to be a good and kind person. He didn't want the fancy life, he just wanted to do his job well. When we look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, we see that the empire was usually at its best when men like him were in charge. So, how did someone become an emperor? It wasn't always as simple as the son taking over for the father. Sometimes a general would win a big war, and his soldiers would just declare him the new emperor. Other times, the Senate would pick someone. But more often than not, it came down to who had the most soldiers on their side. The army was the real power behind the throne. If the soldiers liked you, you were safe. If they didn't, you were in a lot of trouble. Life inside the palace was a mix of incredible luxury and constant fear. The emperor had tasters, people who would eat a bit of his food first to make sure it wasn't poisoned. He had guards called the Praetorian Guard who stood outside his door 24 hours a day. He had people whose only job was to tell him the news from all over the world. He was the busiest man in the world, signing laws, meeting with foreign leaders, and deciding which big projects to build next. Even though most Romans never met the emperor, they felt his presence everywhere. Every time a new emperor took over, he would put on giant games in the Colosseum or give out free food to make everyone like him. It was a way to say, "Don't worry, the new boss is great, and he's going to take care of you." For a regular person, as long as the grain was coming in and the soldiers were staying at the borders, they didn't really care who was sitting on the throne. But as time went on, the palace became more and more disconnected from the real world. The emperors stayed inside their golden walls while the problems outside got worse. The money was losing its value, the borders were being attacked, and the leaders were more interested in their own parties than in the people. This gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom is one of the biggest reasons why the empire eventually started to crumble. But even with the crazy ones and the dangerous plots, the idea of the emperor was what held everything together. He was the symbol of Rome. As long as there was an emperor, people felt like the world was in order. It's a fascinating look at what happens when you give one person all the power in the world. Some use it to build, and some use it to destroy. If you were a kid in Rome, your life started in a very strange way. Unlike today, where every baby is welcomed, in Rome, the father had to decide if the baby could stay. He would look at the newborn, and if he picked it up, it meant the baby was part of the family. If he didn't, well, That's a sad part of history we don't like to think about. But let's say you were picked up. Your life would be full of interesting traditions. One of the coolest things was a necklace called a bulla. Every Roman boy wore one. It was a little locket that held lucky charms inside to keep bad spirits away. You'd wear it until you became a man. To really understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to see that school wasn't a big building with a cafeteria. For most kids, school was just a corner of a busy street or a small porch. It was loud and dusty. Imagine trying to do your math homework while people are shouting about fish and horses right next to you. The teachers were very tough. They believed that if you weren't learning, a little bit of a wake-up call with a wooden stick would help. They didn't have paper like we do. Instead, they used wooden boards covered in a thin layer of dark wax. You would use a metal stick called a stylus to scratch your letters into the wax. If you made a mistake, you just used the flat end of the stick to smooth the wax back out. It was basically the world's first etch-a-sketch. They learned reading, writing, and lots of math. But the most important thing for a Roman boy was learning how to speak in public. They wanted every kid to grow up to be a person who could stand in front of a crowd and convince them of an idea. But life wasn't all school. Roman kids had toys just like you did. We've found dolls made of clay, wooden swords, and even small carts pulled by pet goats. They loved playing games with nuts, a kind of like how kids use marbles today. They would try to throw them into a jar or knock them out of a circle. It shows that no matter how long ago people lived, kids have always found a way to have fun. Now, let's talk about what was on the dinner plate. Most people think Romans just ate grapes and wine, but it was much more interesting, and sometimes gross, than that. For a regular worker, breakfast was just a piece of dry bread. Maybe for lunch, they'd grab a bowl of bench stew from a street shop. These street shops were everywhere because most people didn't have a kitchen in their tiny apartments. It was the original fast food. But if you were rich, dinner was a huge event. They would lie down on couches and eat for hours. They loved to show off how much money they had by eating exotic things. They ate roasted parrots, jellyfish, and even dormice. A dormouse is a little rodent that they would stuff with meat and nuts and cook in honey. It sounds like something from a nightmare, but for them, it was a fancy treat. The most important thing on every Roman table was a sauce called garum. They were obsessed with it. They made it by taking fish guts, putting them in a big jar with salt, and leaving them in the sun for months until they turned into a liquid. It smelled so bad that the government made the factories stay outside the city walls, but the Romans put it on everything, even on fruit and cakes. It was their version of salt or ketchup, and they loved their wine, too. But here's the thing. They almost always mixed it with water. If you drank wine without water, people thought you were a barbarian or someone who couldn't control themselves. They even had warm wine with spices in the winter, which actually sounds pretty good. Eating was the way Romans socialized. It was how they made friends and did business deals. If you were invited to a big dinner, it meant you were finally somebody in the city. You can't walk through Rome without seeing the giant stone buildings. But how did they build them without trucks or cranes? This is one of the biggest secrets of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The Romans were the best engineers in history. They discovered a secret recipe for concrete using volcanic ash. This stuff was so strong that it could stay underwater for 2,000 years and not break. That's why their harbors and bridges are still there today. One of their favorite things to build was the arch. Before the Romans, most buildings used flat tops, which couldn't hold much weight, but the arch spreads the weight out to the sides. This allowed them to build massive things like the Colosseum and the Pantheon. The Pantheon has a giant dome on top that is still the largest unsupported concrete dome in the world. Think about that. Modern engineers with computers still struggle to do what the Romans did with just some string and some smart thinking. They also used their building skills to bring water into the city. They built aqueducts, which look like long stone bridges. These were built with a very slight slope so that gravity would pull the water from the mountains all the way to the city. It was perfectly level over miles and miles of land. This water filled the public fountains and the massive bathhouses. The Romans believed that a city was only as good as its water, and they made sure everyone had enough to stay clean and healthy. Most people think ancient history is just about men fighting wars, But Roman women were incredibly powerful in their own way. Even though they couldn't vote or be generals, they ran the world behind the scenes. A Roman mother was the boss of the house. She managed the money, handled the slaves, and decided how the children should be raised. The paterfamilias or the father might have the legal power, but the matrona or the mother had the real influence. Some women were even successful business owners. We have found old bricks with the names of women stamped on them, showing they owned the factories that built Rome. Other women ran shops or managed large farms while their husbands were away at war. They were tough, smart, and they knew how to play the game of power. There was also a very special group of women called the Vestal Virgins. Their job was to keep a sacred fire burning in a temple in the middle of the city. The Romans believed that if that fire ever went out, Rome would be destroyed. Because of this, these women were treated like royalty. They had the best seats at the games, they could own property, and even the emperor had to show them respect. It shows that in Rome, if you had a job that was important to the gods, you were important to everyone. If you were walking through a Roman street, you could tell exactly how much money someone had just by looking at their clothes. It was like everyone was wearing their bank account on their back. Most people, the workers, the slaves, and the shopkeepers wore something called a tunic. Think of it like a long, oversized t-shirt made of wool or linen that went down to your knees. It was simple, easy to work in, and cheap to make. But if you were a citizen and you wanted to show off, you wore the famous toga. Now, the toga wasn't comfortable. It was a giant, heavy piece of wool cloth that you had to wrap around your body in a very specific way. You couldn't even put it on by yourself. You usually needed a slave to help you get the folds just right. If you were an important leader, your toga had a big purple stripe on the edge. Purple was the most expensive color in the world back then because it was made from thousands of tiny sea snails. It smelled a bit like old fish, but if you wore purple, everyone knew you were a big deal. Women's fashion was all about layers and jewelry. They wore a long dress called a stola, and they loved bright colors like red, yellow, and blue. They were also obsessed with their hair. Rich women would spend hours having their slaves curl their hair and pile it up high on their heads. They even used blonde hair from people in Germany to make wigs. It shows that even 2,000 years ago, people cared a lot about looking cool and following the latest trends. When the sun went down in Rome, the whole mood changed. Today, we have street lights and police cars, but in ancient Rome, once it was dark, it was really dark. There were no lights in the alleys, and that made the city a very dangerous place. If you were rich, you didn't go out at night unless you had a group of tough slaves carrying torches to protect you. If you were poor, you stayed inside, locked your door, and hoped nobody tried to break in. There wasn't a regular police force like we have now. Instead, they had the vigils. These guys were half firefighters and half police. They walked the streets with buckets of water and axes. Their main job was to stop fires, because a fire in a crowded city like Rome could kill thousands of people in one night. They also looked out for burglars, but if someone stole your wallet, the vigils usually wouldn't help you catch them. You had to do that yourself. To understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to realize how much the night belonged to the underworld. There were secret bars and gambling dens hidden in the basements of the city. People would play games with dice and bet their last coins. It was a rough world, far away from the beautiful marble temples you see in pictures. It was a city of two faces, bright and golden during the day, but dark and scary at night. If you got sick in Rome, you were in for a rough time. They didn't know about germs or how diseases spread. Instead, they thought you got sick because your body's juices were out of balance. If a doctor came to see you, his first idea might be to use leeches to suck out some of your blood. It sounds like something from a horror movie, but they truly believed it would make you better. But they weren't totally clueless. Roman doctors were actually very good at fixing things they could see. If a soldier got hit with a spear, the doctors were amazing at cleaning the wound with wine, which killed bacteria, even if they didn't know why, and stitching it up. They even had special tools for brain surgery and fixing cataracts in people's eyes. They used herbal medicines, too. They used willow bark to help with pain, and we now know that willow bark actually contains the same stuff that's an aspirin. Still, most people didn't trust doctors much. They were expensive and often made things worse. Instead, most Romans would go to a temple and pray to a god like Aesculapius. They would leave a little clay model of whatever was hurting like a clay arm or a clay aura and hope the god would fix it for them. It was a world where science and magic were all mixed together. We always hear about the lions in the Colosseum, but did the Romans have pets at home? Absolutely. The most popular pet was the dog. Romans loved dogs for two reasons. They were great companions, and they were the best burglar alarms. We've found ancient mosaics on the floors of Roman houses that have pictures of dogs with the words Cave Canem written on them. That literally means beware of the dog. Some things never change. They also loved birds. Rich families would have parrots that could talk, or even pet crows. Cats weren't as popular at first, but later on, they became the favorite way to keep mice and rats out of the grain stores. But because Rome was such a huge empire, people also had very weird pets. If you were super rich, you might have a pet monkey or even a tame cheetah to show off to your friends. In the streets, you'd see all kinds of animals. Farmers would bring in pigs and sheep to sell, and donkeys were the trucks of the ancient world, carrying heavy loads of wine and oil. The city was full of the sounds of barking, chirping, and the clatter of hooves on stone. It was a loud, living place that felt very much like a giant zoo. Understanding how they lived with animals is a big part of knowing the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, because their economy and their entertainment were built on the backs of these creatures. If you looked around the streets in Rome, you would see thousands of people working, but a huge number of them, maybe 1 out of every 3 people, were actually slaves. It's the saddest and most unfair part of the Roman story. But you can't understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome without talking about them. They were the engine that kept the whole empire moving. They did everything from cleaning the streets to teaching the emperor's children. But here is something most people don't know. Not all slaves had the same life. If you were a city slave, your life might be a lot like a worker today. You might be a doctor, a secretary, or a chef. Some city slaves were treated almost like part of the family. They could even save up their own money and, after many years, buy their freedom. When a slave was freed, it was a huge moment. They would put on a special pointed hat called a pileus to show everyone they were now free. It was like a badge of honor. But if you were a rural slave, life was a total nightmare. These were the people who worked in the deep mines or on giant farms. They were often kept in chains and worked from sunrise to sunset with barely any food. They didn't have any hope of becoming free. Their hard work is what made the rich people in Rome so wealthy. It shows that the beautiful statues and marble temples were built on the backs of people who had nothing. We've talked about the Colosseum before, but let's look at the men who actually fought there, the gladiators. Most people think they were just prisoners who were killed for fun, but that's not the whole story. Gladiators were actually the first professional sports stars. They were trained in special schools. They had the best doctors, and they even had special diets to make them strong. A gladiator fight wasn't always a fight to the death, because it cost a lot of money to train a gladiator. The owners didn't want them to die in every match. It was more like a high-stakes boxing match. If a gladiator fought really well but lost, the crowd might cheer for him to live. The emperor would then give a thumbs up or thumbs down. If he got the thumbs up, he would walk away and fight another day. The best gladiators were famous all over the empire. People would paint their names on the walls of houses, and girls would wear jewelry made from their sweat, which is kind of gross, but true. They were symbols of bravery. Even though they were technically slaves, they were the heroes of the common people. This love for blood and bravery is a huge part of the spirit that built the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. If gladiators were like boxers, then chariot racers were like Formula One drivers. This was the most popular sport in Rome. The races happened at the Circus Maximus, a stadium so big it could hold over 150,000 people. That's twice as many people as most modern stadiums. Imagine the noise of all those people screaming as horses flew around the track at top speed. There were 4 main teams: the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens. People were absolutely crazy about their teams. They didn't just watch the race, they lived and breathed it. If you were a Green fan, you wouldn't even talk to a Blue fan. They would even cast magic spells on the other team's horses to try and make them trip. The drivers, called charioteers, could become incredibly rich. There was one driver named Gaius Appius Diocles who won so many races that he became the richest athlete in all of human history. He had more money than some of the most famous billionaires today. It just goes to show that even 2,000 years ago, people were willing to pay a lot of money to see their favorite sports stars win. With millions of people living together, you need a lot of rules. The Romans were the first people to really figure out the big legal system. They believed that the law should be the same for everyone. Well, at least for all citizens. They invented the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty. That's a rule we still use in our courts today. If you had a problem with your neighbor, maybe they stole your goat or moved a fence, you would go to the forum and find a judge. There were no lawyers like we have now, but there were orators. These were people who were amazing at giving speeches. You would hire one to stand up and talk to the judge for you. They would use all kinds of tricks to make the judge feel sorry for you or make your neighbor look like a liar. The laws were very strict. If you were caught stealing, you had to pay back double what you took. If you couldn't pay, you might become a slave to the person you robbed. They wanted people to be afraid of breaking the rules because it was the only way to keep a giant empire from falling into chaos. This focus on law and order is exactly what allowed the Romans to stay in power for so long. Even though the Romans worked hard, they knew how to party. They had more holidays than we do today. If you were living in the city, it felt like there was a festival or a parade almost every week. But the biggest and craziest one of all was called Saturnalia. This happened in December, and it was the most fun time of the year. To understand what life was actually like in ancient Rome, you have to see what happened during Saturnalia. For a few days, the whole world turned upside down. Slaves didn't have to work. In fact, their masters would wait on them and serve them dinner. People would wear funny hats, give each other little gifts like clay dolls or candles, and shout "Io Saturnalia" in the streets. It was a time for everyone to forget their troubles and just have fun. It's actually where a lot of our modern holiday traditions come from. But they had some weird festivals too. There was one called Lupercalia where young men would run through the streets wearing only pieces of goat skin. They would carry leather strips and gently tap people with them as they ran past. They believed this brought good luck and health. It sounds totally crazy to us, but for the Romans, it was a very serious and holy tradition. It shows that even though they were smart builders, they were still very connected to old, mysterious rituals. For a long time, the Romans worshipped their old gods like Jupiter and Mars. But as the empire got bigger, people started bringing in new ideas from faraway lands. Some people started following a secret religion called Mithraism, which was mostly for soldiers. They would meet in dark underground caves and have secret ceremonies. Others started following the goddess Isis from Egypt, but the biggest change came from a small group of people following a man named Jesus. At first, the Romans didn't like this new religion called Christianity. They thought it was dangerous because Christians wouldn't worship the emperor as a god. This led to some very dark times where Christians were hunted down. But, believe it or not, the more the government tried to stop it, the faster it grew. Eventually, even the emperor himself became a Christian. This changed everything. It changed the laws, it changed the holidays, and it changed how people thought about the world. This shift in what people believed is a huge part of the story when you look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. When the old gods were gone, the very soul of the empire started to look different. We've talked about the army and the traders, but none of them could move without the Roman roads. I know roads sound boring, but these were the internet of the ancient world. Before the Romans, most roads were just muddy paths. If it rained, you were stuck. But the Romans built roads that were so good that some are still used as foundations for highways today. They didn't just throw some rocks down. They dug deep trenches and filled them with layers of sand, gravel, and heavy stones. The top layer was made of big, flat paving stones that fit together like a puzzle. They were even built with a little curve so the rain would run off into the ditches on the side. This meant the army could march in any weather. If you were a traveler, these roads were your lifeline. Every few miles, there was a milestone. It was a big stone pillar that told you exactly how far you were from the next town. It was the first time in history that people could accurately measure their trips. These roads connected the cold forests of Germany to the hot sands of Egypt. They were the glue that held the whole giant empire together. How much did things cost in Rome? Well, it depended on what you were buying. The Romans used coins made of gold, silver, and bronze. The most common silver coin was the denarius. 1 denarius was about what a regular worker would earn in a day. With that, you could buy enough bread and wine to feed your family. But as the empire got older, things started to get more expensive. This is because the emperors started putting less silver into the coins to save money. When people realized the coins weren't pure silver anymore, they started charging more for their goods. This is called inflation. Suddenly, a loaf of bread that used to cost 1 coin now cost 5. This made life very hard for the poor. In the markets, you'd see people arguing and shouting because prices were going up every week. The government even tried to pass laws to stop prices from rising, but it didn't work. This economic mess was one of the big reasons why the empire eventually started to fall apart. It's a reminder that even the most powerful empire in the world can be taken down by something as simple as a coin that isn't worth what it says it is. So, after hundreds of years of being the most powerful thing on earth, how does a story this big finally end? Most people think Rome fell in a single day, like a building getting knocked down by a wrecking ball. But that's not really what happened. It was more like a slow leak in a tire. Little by little, the things that made Rome great started to break. To understand the end, we have to look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire as a whole. The empire simply got too big for its own good. It was so giant that it became impossible to protect the borders. Groups of people from the north, who the Romans called barbarians, started pushing into Roman lands. At the same time, the money we talked about was losing its value every single day. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were getting desperate. People often ask me what life was actually like in ancient Rome during those final years. It was a time of fear. People started leaving the big cities because they weren't safe anymore. The grand marble buildings we've been talking about began to crumble because the government didn't have the money to fix them. Eventually, the city of Rome itself was attacked and robbed. It was the first time in 800 years that an enemy had stepped foot inside the city. It was a sign that the dream of Rome was over. But here is the amazing thing. Even though the empire fell, it never really went away. Think about it. We still use the Roman alphabet to write. We still use Roman ideas for our laws and our courts. If you've ever walked on a paved road or looked at a building with an arch, you're looking at a Roman idea. They were so good at building and organizing that we are still using their blueprint 2,000 years later. The story of Rome is really the story of us. It's a story about how humans can build incredible things when they work together, but also how easily those things can fall apart if we stop taking care of each other. The people who walked those dusty stone streets weren't just characters in a book. They were real people who loved their kids, cheered for their sports teams, and hoped for a better tomorrow. I've spent a lot of time today walking you through these ancient alleys and golden palaces, and I really hope you enjoy the trip. History can sometimes feel like a bunch of dry dates and names, but when you look at the small details, it's the most exciting story ever told. If you found this deep dive into the Roman world interesting, it would mean a lot to me if you could hit that like button. It tells the computer that this is a story worth sharing. And if you want to join me for more of these massive journeys into the past, please subscribe to the channel. I have so many more secrets to share with you, and I don't want you to miss any of them. Thanks for sticking with me until the very end. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. This is the Boring History Guy, and I'll be waiting for you in the next one. Take care, and keep looking at the world with curious eyes.